Hey everybody, welcome to this Adobe Live. This is a session of pro tips where we're going to be looking at working with smart objects in Adobe Photoshop. My name is Cory Hall. I am a queer graphic designer based here in Portland, Oregon. If you are joining us in the chat, just drop us a hello. Let us know where you're joining from. Um, like I mentioned, we're going to be looking at smart objects in Adobe Photoshop. I've got this document open in front of me right here. Let's see. So a little bit about what we're going to be working on today. So I have this poster design concept that I have been thinking a little bit about. I think we're all pretty aware of climate change, global warming has really been on my mind recently. And so I have this saying that has been on my mind. The future is coming when you start to feel scared. Sorry, bear with me here. This is actually my first solo stream, so I'm a little bit nervous today. I usually do these Adobe live streams. I'm either hosting or guesting. We've got Crypto Headhunter joining from City of Angels and Artists. Wade Acuff, hey Cory, hey Jack Watson. Jack and I actually did a live stream a couple of weeks ago. So let me get into this. The future is coming when you start to feel scared. So I'm going to start designing a poster concept just around this phrase that I typed here on the screen. Like I mentioned, it's kind of an environmental / like climate statement because climate change has really been on my mind. I'm up here in Portland, Oregon, where we're getting a lot of smoke from the wildfires. And so with all of this like smoke in the air, it's coming down from the Canadian wildfires. Climate change has really just been on my mind. And so this phrase here has really just kind of been resonating with me. So what I have done is I have pulled a couple of images from Adobe stock online, and I'm going to pull them into this Photoshop document. I'm going to drag them in to this Photoshop document and start kind of building them out as background images and as sort of supplementary images that will come together to create this poster. So let's see. Oh, we've got Penny Doodle saying hi. We love planet Earth. Sad face. That's exactly how I feel too. So for the background image to start, I took this image that I pulled in from Adobe stock. I dragged it into this Photoshop file that I created, and I typically start my Photoshop files at an Instagram dimension. So 1080 by 1350 is how I usually start out my Photoshop documents because they usually end up as posters that live on Instagram. So I took this image that I pulled from Adobe stock, dropped it into the Photoshop file. And what's really cool, and I think this is a pretty recent change to Photoshop as of Photoshop 2023, but it automatically drops objects in as smart objects. So if I take this image, like I mentioned, drop it in here into Photoshop, and I'm going to place it and resize it as the background image, and it comes in as a smart object. So if you see this image, this is the new layer of the image that I dropped in here, and it's got this little thumbnail at the bottom that indicates it as a smart object. If you have used smart objects in the past, you'll know that if you double click into a smart object, it actually opens it up into a separate Photoshop file. And this allows you to edit objects or images that you drop into Photoshop in a non-destructive way. And so because I dropped this image in as a smart object, I'm able to then double click it, and it opens it up into a separate Photoshop file so that I can edit this image separately from my main document. And I will be able to make changes within this new Photoshop file in a non-destructive way that isn't going to affect or lose the quality of the original image that I placed into the previous document. So just kind of to show an example of how this might work, if I want to, I can put text over this image here. And so again, we're editing the smart object file within Photoshop. And if I just hit OK and save this, let's see. We're going to cancel. You cannot save. Oh, that's weird. Let me try this again. Don't save. So I'm going to open up my smart object file. We're going to just place some text in. Save. Let me flatten it. There we go. So because I placed the background image in as a smart object and then double clicked into the smart object, then it links that file over into the original Adobe Photoshop file that I placed in. So I'm going to drop in this file again. I'm going to place it as a smart object. I'm going to resize it to be the background image. So what another really cool feature of of Photoshop Smart Objects is I'm able to, like I mentioned, non-destructively edit this image. And I can use Adobe Photoshop filters to edit the image. Here we go. So I'm going to use filter. I'm going to go to filter gallery. Oh, and because I have, let's see, set this over here, filter gallery, I can use these Photoshop filters to edit the smart object. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe do a halftone pattern. And because it's a smart object and because it's non-destructive editing, I can go over here to the layers panel and double click the filter gallery. And I can make changes to this smart object and then go back and change the filter setting or change the editing. Whereas if this wasn't a smart object, I wouldn't be able to go back and make those changes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these filters that I placed on it. And I'm going to start editing. Let's see. So because I kind of want this to be what I'm thinking for this poster is what I think I will do is probably some kind of color halftone filter to give it almost like a retro glowing sort of effect and make it look almost like a magazine or printed scene. And again, I'm going to have this as the background. I'm going to place the text over it just so that I've got an idea of where the typography is going to fall. And going to get it to fill the whole screen here. And I'm using this text as placeholder text right now, just so that I have an idea of where the rest of my images are going to go. And let's see, we've got RB in the chat. We've got, hey, Crypto. Hi, Robert. Hi, Penny. Thank you all for joining us. And again, if you guys are joining us, let us know where you're joining from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have any questions or experience with smart objects, feel free to drop it into the chat. Sort of the idea that I have behind this poster is somewhat of an idyllic background, like I mentioned, with sort of a stand-in or almost scene-like effect, juxtaposed with these images that show a little bit more of the like fear that I mentioned with this text that I'm going to have in the poster. So you know the future is coming when you start to feel scared. And so juxtaposing some more of these idyllic, this more idyllic background image with some images to sort of show that like fear behind this sort of impending climate change doom. So I placed this image in here again, and I placed it as a smart object. And so what I'm going to do is, because it's a smart object, I'm going to double click into that image, and I'm just going to kind of play around with some different filters and see if I can give this image a little bit more of a posterized effect or a little bit more contrast or pop. So what I think will be kind of cool is, because we have such a saturated image in the background, what I might want to do is give this, like I mentioned, a bit more contrast using the threshold filter. And I'm probably going to, what might make sense actually is to do a threshold over here is a threshold within this smart object file over here so that I don't need to do, so that I can make it in here. So I'm going for some kind of effect that, again, is like a little bit scary. It shows a little bit of that doom and gloom feeling behind the main saying of the image. And so threshold is a really great tool to give a lot of contrast. And I think that this, can't save this document back to its original file format. Flatten layers and discard extra. So I'm honestly not sure why it is giving me this. Let's see if I do that threshold, save the smart. I mean, I don't want to flatten it, but yeah, Penny Doodles is saying the typography taking up a larger space also gives it an unease, like the statement is closing in on us. And that's kind of the vibe that I was going for. I want it to feel a little bit uneasy. I want it to feel almost a little bit hopeless. Okay, well, I'm gonna flatten this, save it. Interesting. Okay, well, I seem to be having trouble with this smart object here. I'm not sure why it is, why it's not allowing me to save it as a smart object. It's actually a little bit strange. So instead, what I'm going to do is do a threshold adjustment layer and change it so that it only applies to the layer that is right beneath it. Okay. So we're gonna have, and I'm just kind of playing around with these right now to see what placement sort of works. And I'm liking this kind of big black and white feeling here. This is another image that I pulled from Adobe stock. I pulled it as just a preview image because I'm not sure if I want to use this for sure. So I didn't want to use up an Adobe stock credit on it until I made up my mind. But I do kind of like the effect that this has here. It gives a nice texture, and the threshold is really pretty effective in giving us like that bold contrast. I'm going to drop this in here. And so I'm choosing these images kind of based on this based on sort of like this sense of looming and impending doom that I mentioned. They're like a little bit mysterious. I think that they're almost a little bit stressful in the way that this person is looking off into the distance, this person is covering up their face. And so they give like a nice contrast to that sort of bright and bold, bright and kind of like colorful background image. I'm gonna start building these out, giving them some kind of a stroke around the outside, just to frame them a little bit nicely. This one could use it too. And something else that I think could look good with these is a gradient map, because as much as I like the black and white, I think that maybe something with a little bit more color could work. And so I'm going over here to the color pickers on the side, and I'm going to go and make an adjustment layer. And I'm going to go over and make a gradient map. And because I picked the colors in the color picker, then when I went over to create an adjustment layer with a gradient map, it pulled that color. And so I'm going to take this gradient map, I'm going to bring it over into each of the groups that contain my other images, just so that they all are of that same sort of like color palette. And what I think will also be nice is I'm going to change the stroke color to match the color that's within the gradient map. I'm going to do the same thing for this one over here. And, you know, I don't think that this image is working super well, but we're going to do that. And I do feel like we need a third image just to help balance this out a little bit. And I pulled an image of this crying baby because that's like kind of how I feel when I watch the news, and it has anything to do with climate change. And I feel like it does sort of like encapsulate this phrase in a really kind of like nice way. The baby looks and feels very scared here. I'm going to add the threshold to this crying baby as well. And it's interesting, when we were playing with this threshold, what it's doing is it's kind of coming in around the baby in an interesting way and framing it in a way that feels like it's like the background is closing in around him, which feels also pretty appropriate to the theme of this poster. And I think, yeah, I think that that works a little bit nicer than the other image of the eyes. Okay. So kind of despite that glitch with the smart object, as I was double clicking and trying to enter into that smart object, it wasn't allowing me to save it. And I'm not sure why, so I might be missing something. But another thing that is really cool about smart objects in Photoshop is that you can copy and paste images from an Illustrator document, and it will give you the option to copy and paste it as a smart object into Photoshop. So what that allows you to do is, I am in an Illustrator document right here. These are SVG files that I downloaded from Adobe stock, and I'm going to copy and paste this globe, and I'm going to go over to Photoshop here. And I'm going to paste it as a smart object. And it gives me the option to paste as pixels, path, shape layer. And actually what I'll do right now is, just to give a good example, is I'm going to paste this as pixels. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to copy and paste it over from Illustrator, and I'm going to paste it as a smart object. So we have these two different, the two of the same image pasted as two different types of objects within Photoshop. We've got the smart object on the right, and we've got the pixel image on the left. And this is what I'll do, is just kind of demonstrate the difference between these two objects. We have the smart object and the non-smart object. If I select both of them and scale them way down, hit enter. And then if I change my mind and decide that I want to scale them back up, hit enter. So what happened is I scaled these down and then I scaled them back up. The pixelated image here on the left lost a lot of quality when I scaled it down and then scaled it back up. We lost all of that quality, the pixel quality, whereas the vector smart object, when I scaled it down and scaled it back up, it retained its quality. So that's a really pretty cool feature of smart objects, is it, like I mentioned, gives you sort of that non-destructive editing. So just another really good benefit of using smart objects as opposed to pixel objects. I'm going to go ahead and delete the non-smart object from here, and I'm going to start playing around with this smart object. And what I think would be cool is because the SVG file that I downloaded has 3 different weights of this little icon, I am going to kind of do this almost like a transition between these globes to show sort of, I don't know, to sort of demonstrate the changing nature of climate change and the changing nature of the world right now. let's see. So I'm going to edit, bring this down. Just like this. And I kind of like this because, like I mentioned, it's like showing somewhat of a transition from the state of the world in one way, moving it all over to the state of the world in this sort of like new reality or the future. And so because these are smart objects, what I can do is I can double click. Let's call this one, we're going to go into this over here. And it took me back into my Illustrator file. Created a new Illustrator file for this smart object that's living in Photoshop. And I don't want it to be this color anymore. So because it's a smart object, what I can do is I can, like I said, double click on the smart object. It'll open it up into a new smart object file within Illustrator. And I have the ability to make edits to this object. And when I save it, those saved changes will be reflected in the Photoshop document where the smart object lives. And I'm seeing a question from Justin in the chat. Justin from Dallas here. Can you turn the groups into smart objects to do what you wanted, or is that just adding extra steps to still run into the same hiccups? So what you can do is you can change a group into a smart object. So I have this group. This is the group with the baby in it, and I'll just rename this group group or baby. I can right click this, convert to a smart object. And then when I double click into the smart object, it opens it up in a new Photoshop file with that folder that I created. So essentially it took the folder from this original Photoshop file and created a new Photoshop file with that existing folder in it. So that's kind of a good way to get around that problem that I was running into. So if I go threshold, I can change the threshold here, change it with the baby, and then it changes the smart object file in my original Photoshop file. So again, I adjusted the threshold here in the smart object file. And when I hit save, it changes the smart object in my original Photoshop file. So that's a really great thing to keep in mind as you are using smart objects in Photoshop. You can turn just about any object or group you want to. I mean, you can change any group into a smart object by right-clicking, converting into a smart object, and then it will create that smart object, which is then an editable Photoshop file outside of your original file. So we're kind of building out this poster, and we are getting close to time. We're going to log off in just a couple of minutes here. But we've got a good sort of framework for the poster here. And what we've done is sort of looked at how we can drop files into Photoshop, edit those files as smart objects in a non-destructive way without losing quality, and while retaining the ability to edit different smart filters and effects on those smart objects, as well as placing in Illustrator files, copying and pasting them into a Photoshop document, and being able to edit and save them within Illustrator, save them in Illustrator, and then go back into Photoshop and see those changes, those saved changes reflected in the Photoshop document. We're going to pick back up on this tomorrow. So if you would like to join me again tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 10:30, Tuesday, August 22nd, we're just going to spend a little bit more time on this poster. We'll touch it up and refine it in a little bit. In some small ways, we're also going to play with the typography. And what we'll do too is look at how we can use type as smart objects in Photoshop, just to kind of polish this poster off in a way, give it a nice sort of like completed and refined look about it. So let's see. So thank you all for joining us in the chat. Hope to see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Tuesday, August 22nd.